Welcome to this third session of the second module on the deep dive on CPTPP. In this session, we'll focus on the provisions included in the agreement that relate to trade and sustainable development. We will look into what is covered, what is their scope, and what they mean in terms of enforceability. Thank you for listening.
The CPTPP set out several binding commitments from parties intending to protect and enforce labor rights and improve working conditions and living standards, including in Vietnam. This session will introduce the generic rules on sustainable and inclusive aspects of trade covered in the CPTPP, namely labor, environment, gender, and inclusiveness and SMEs. We will look at what each of these provisions means for cooperatives. We will first consider labor standards under the CPTPP. The CPTPP has set out several binding commitments from parties, including Vietnam, with an aim to protect and enforce labor rights and improve working conditions and living standards. These commitments include upholding labor protection standards, corporate social responsibility, public participation including submission, engagement and procedural guarantees, and contact points and cooperation. We will now discuss each of these commitments in detail. The first commitment is to uphold labor protection standards. The labor chapter in the agreement requires CPTPP parties to maintain or adopt legislation to ensure the protection of internationally recognized labor rights, namely freedom of association and collective bargaining, elimination of compulsory labor, abolition of child labor, and elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. CPTPP parties are required to have laws governing acceptable conditions of work, which cover minimum wages, hours of work, and occupational health and safety. The chapter further prohibits parties from weakening the protections afforded to workers under their labor laws or from failing to enforce them to inappropriately encourage trade or investment. Additionally, the chapter promotes initiatives to discourage the importation of goods produced by forced or compulsory labor, including child labor. Next, we will consider corporate social responsibility, also known as CSR. CSR is the way through which a company achieves a balance of economic, environmental, and social imperatives, while at the same time addressing the expectations of shareholders and stakeholders. Examples of CSR include environmental management, eco-efficiency, responsible sourcing, and good governance, among others. The CPTPP encourages parties to motivate businesses in their territories to voluntarily adopt CSR initiatives related to labor issues, such as the UN Global Compact on Corporate Sustainability Initiative. With regard to public participation, the agreement covers three different areas. First is public submissions. The public can lodge written submissions on any matters related to the labor chapter according to domestic procedures. Second, on public engagement, CPTPP parties have to establish or maintain a national labor consultative or advisory body or similar mechanism for members of the public to provide their views on matters related to the labor chapter. The CPTPP also provides a channel for interested persons to participate in the parties' cooperative labor dialogue. Thirdly, the CPTPP promotes public awareness of labor laws through the publication of labor laws and enforcement and compliance procedures. The CPTPP also obliges parties countries to provide access to fair, equitable, and transparent proceedings to enforce labor laws. The public can lodge written submissions on any matters related to the labor chapter according to domestic procedures through contact points. Under the agreement, parties are obliged to establish contact points to address matters under the labor chapter. Contact points act as the primary form of engagement between CPTPP parties on labor matters, as well as a channel for communication with the public. The designated contact point of Vietnam for labor-related matters under the CPTPP is the International Cooperation Department of the Ministry of Labor, Invalids and Social Affairs. You can find the contact details on the slide. With regard to cooperation, the agreement requires that each party shall invite the views and, as appropriate, participation of its stakeholders, including worker and employer representatives, in identifying potential areas for cooperation and undertaking cooperative activities. Let us now move on to environment protection provisions under the CPTPP. The CPTPP is among the agreements with the broadest scope of environmental protection commitments that Vietnam has made. These commitments mean a more robust domestic legal framework, and domestic businesses, including cooperatives, will need to act more responsibly towards environmental protection. Some of these areas of commitment, such as on transition to a low-emission economy or environment goods and services, can be an opportunity for cooperatives to adopt new and more resilient business models. Cooperatives may also use public participation and submission mechanisms to address environmental concerns affecting their production and livelihood. The CPTPP recognizes the sovereign right of each party to establish its own levels of domestic environmental protection. However, to promote high levels of environmental protection and avoid the possible negative impact of trade and investment on the environment, the CPTPP forbids parties from lowering their environmental laws in a manner that weakens or reduces the protection in order to encourage trade or investment between the parties. Under the CPTPP, parties affirm their commitments made under various multilateral environment agreements. These agreements cover a range of issues including ozone layer protection, marine environment protection, ship pollution protection, biodiversity conservation and elimination of illegal, unreported and unregulated IUU fishing among others. Vietnam has ratified many of these multilateral environment agreements and has enacted laws and regulations to mandate environmental protection in these areas. These include Law on Environment Protection 2020, Law on Forestry 2017, Fisheries Law 2017, Maritime Code 2015, and Law on Biodiversity 2008. Furthermore, the Penal Code 2015, amended in 2017, criminalizes several environment-related offenses. The CPTPP also includes binding and non-binding commitments in specific environmental issues. Binding commitments are made regarding the protection of the ozone layer, protection of the marine environment from ship pollution, sustainable marine capture fisheries, and conservation of endangered species. With regard to protection of the ozone layer, the CPTPP requires parties to maintain and adopt laws and policies to control the production and consumption of substances that modify the ozone layer and negatively affect human health and the environment in accordance with the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. On protection of marine environment, CPTPP parties are committed to ensuring cooperation, public participation, and consultation on measures related to protecting the marine environment from ship pollution in accordance with the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships and its amendments. Regarding fisheries, CPTPP parties agreed to address overfishing and unsustainable utilization of fisheries resources by establishing a fisheries management system and refrain from granting subsidies for fishing that negatively affects overfished fish stocks or any fishing vessel listed for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. On conservation and trade, CPTPP parties committed to enacting and enforcing laws to combat the illegal trade of wild fauna and flora in accordance with the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Cooperative or non-binding actions are committed to trade and biodiversity, invasive alien species, promoting a low-emission economy, and trade in environment goods and services. The CPTPP parties agreed to advance the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity through their laws and policies. The CPTPP parties also agreed to facilitate access to genetic resources within their territory, subject to consent from the authorities of the party providing the access. Regarding invasive alien species, CPTPP parties committed to cooperating by sharing information and experience that will help in controlling the activities of invasive alien species and possible eradication of the species. The CPTPP also encourages parties to transition to a low-emissions economy in consideration of their domestic circumstances and capabilities. Recognizing the importance of promoting trade and investment in environmental goods and services to address many global environmental challenges, the CPTPP parties agreed to collaborate to remove barriers to trade in environmental goods and services via bilateral and plurilateral cooperative initiatives. To enhance public participation, the CPTPP requires Vietnam, as well as all other CPTPP parties, to make information about environmental laws and policies publicly available. Additionally, for enforcing its environmental laws, parties are obliged to ensure access to judicial, quasi-judicial or administrative proceedings that are fair, equitable, transparent and comply with due process of law. Similarly to labor standards, The CPTPP requires each party to designate a body responsible for accepting and considering written submissions from the public on the implementation of its environmental commitments under the CPTPP. The designated contact point of Vietnam for environmental matters under the CPTPP is the Vietnam Environment Administration of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment of Vietnam. The full address of the contact point is provided in the slide. CPTPP parties also committed to encouraging enterprises to voluntarily adopt corporate social responsibility initiatives on environmental issues. The provision imposes no binding obligations on CPTPP parties, although it encourages corporate sustainability initiatives on environmental issues, which would affect Vietnam's business community. Let us now move on to the gender equality and social inclusion provisions under the CPTPP. With regard to gender equality and social inclusion, the CPTPP parties reaffirm the importance of promoting gender equality, indigenous rights, labor-inclusive trade, sustainable development, and traditional knowledge. They recognize the importance of respecting, preserving and maintaining knowledge and practices of indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles that contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. The CPTPP also recognizes the need for a broad-based distribution of the benefits of economic growth through the expansion of business and industry and includes rules under different chapters to provide benefits to women and women-owned businesses, indigenous people and local communities. The agreement promotes gender equality through different chapters including the Labor Chapter, the Development Chapter and the Cooperation Chapter. The Labor Chapter of the CPTPP requires that parties adopt laws to eliminate discrimination against women in the workplace. It also encourages cooperation in the promotion of equality and elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation for migrant workers, or in the areas of age, disability and other characteristics not related to merit or the requirements of employment, and protection of vulnerable workers, including migrant workers, and low-waged, casual, or contingent workers. Through the Development Chapter, CPTPP parties commit to enhance the ability of women, including workers and business owners, to fully access and benefit from the opportunities created by the agreement through various activities. These include the exchange of officials and exchanging information and experience on skills and capacity development, enhancing access to markets, technology, and financing, developing leadership networks, and promoting workplace flexibility best practices for women. The Cooperation and Capacity Building Chapter of the CPTPP requires parties to strengthen cooperation and capacity building activities to assist in several areas, including the promotion of education, culture, and gender equality. Additionally, the CPTPP promotes traditional knowledge and lifestyle through provisions on environment and intellectual property rights. In the Environment Chapter, CPTPP parties recognize the importance of respecting, preserving, and maintaining knowledge and practices of indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles that contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. In addition to rules that aim at ensuring the inclusion of indigenous peoples in international trade, the CPTPP also contains provisions on preserving traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. These provisions apply to the knowledge and cultural expressions of indigenous peoples and include encouraging the exchange of information between IP offices of CPTPP parties to enhance the understanding of issues related to traditional knowledge and the quality patent examination of patents related to traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. It should be noted that the CPTPP allows parties to establish appropriate measures to respect, preserve, and promote traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. Vietnam also reserves the policy space to enact beneficial policies for socially, economically, and geographically disadvantaged minorities and ethnic groups. Under the Schedule for Investment, Vietnam reserves the right to adopt or maintain any measure conferring rights or privileges to socially, economically, and geographically disadvantaged minorities and ethnic groups. This includes the right to adopt or maintain any measure concerning investment in, building of, operating, and exploiting telecommunication networks and services serving ethnic minorities in rural and remote areas of Vietnam. For example, Vietnam reserves the right to adopt or maintain any measure concerning investment in, building of, operating, and exploiting telecommunication networks and services serving ethnic minorities in rural and remote areas of Vietnam. For financial services, Vietnam reserves the right to adopt or maintain any measure, such as government-supported loans. guarantees and insurance to promote the welfare and employment of ethnic minorities and people living in disadvantaged areas. These measures may include income security and insurance, social security, social welfare, social development, social housing, poverty reduction, public education, public training, health, childcare, among others. We will now look at the final provision, which relates small and medium-sized enterprises. The CPTPP recognizes the barriers faced by SMEs and dedicates a chapter that aims to improve SME participation in international trade. The first channel through which this is done is information sharing. The CPTPP requires that parties establish and maintain a website dedicated to SMEs and containing information regarding the CPTPP, including the full text and summary of the agreement, a description of the rules relevant to SMEs, and any additional information or resources that could be helpful to SMEs such as customs regulations and procedures and taxation information. The website should also include links to the SME websites and relevant government agencies or other entities that provide information on trading, investing, or doing business in that party's territory. Information on the CPTPP can be found on the Vietnam Trade Repository portal. Other useful websites include the Northern Small and Medium Enterprise Support Center and the Southern Small and Medium Enterprise Support Center. The relevant links are provided on the slide. Another channel through which the CPTPP aims to improve SME participation in international trade is through the SMEs Committee. The CPTPP requires parties to establish a committee on SMEs, composed of government representatives from each CPTPP party. The SME Committee will be responsible for collaborating and facilitating activities and programs that assist SMEs in taking advantage of the CPTPP and participating in and contributing to global value chains. Thank you for listening to this module, and we look forward to welcoming you in the next sessions.